Hi, everyone. On behalf of Vivvi, I'm so happy to welcome you today. I'm Rachel Duda, the Vice President of Learning at Vivvi, and I'm so excited to jump in with our friends at Solid Starts today about one of the hottest topics for so many parents of young children, feeding. Today, we're going to talk specifically about what happens when you're feeding as a team with a partner, a caregiver, a daycare provider, or someone else in your village. And unless you're literally the only grown-up feeding your child, there's definitely something in this conversation for you. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Marisa Suarez, occupational therapist, feeding and swallowing specialist, and certified lactation education counselor with Solid Starts. She not only has experience working with children and families, but she's also a parent of 3, so she knows this topic intimately. Together, we're going to do our best to address some of your questions about feeding strategies, communication anxieties, and so much more.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. I'm Marisa, and I have twin 2-year-olds and a 5-year-old boy right now at home. They're actually in preschool right now. So I've had them actually in daycare. I've had them in home daycare before. I've had family members watch them. I've had babysitters. So I definitely have had a full gamut of experiences in interacting with caregivers as well. And I've shared some probably similar frustrations to many of you here.
Thanks, Marisa. So excited to have you as the expert today. If you're not already familiar with Vivvi, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we do. Vivvi is on a mission to reinvent childcare and early learning for today's families. We currently have 5 campuses in New York and 2 new campuses opening soon on the Upper East Side and in Westchester. And we specialize in care and early learning for ages 6 weeks to 5 years old. We also partner with employers of all sizes to bring childcare and early learning as a benefit to working parents. And we truly believe it's our mission to support the whole family, not just with high quality care and learning, but also with education and resources for those early years, which is why we're hosting this conversation today. Before we get started, just a few program logistics that I'll share with you, and then we'll dive in. I just want to say that I appreciate so many of you joining us today. I know that you have so many things on your plate and so many things to do, and we're so grateful that you were able to carve out some time to join us. So thank you. We have about 45 minutes together, and I'll use the first 30 minutes to go through questions with Marisa, and then we'll go through some of your questions. The chat is open, so feel free to drop a question anytime during the webinar. We'll do our best to get through as much as we can in the time that we do have together. And with that, I just want to acknowledge that feeding your child is such a huge topic, and there's just no way that we'll get through everything in 45 minutes. I wish we could, but there's just too much. But I do promise that you'll walk away with at least one practical, applicable tool that will make you feel more successful for whatever's coming your way. So with that, let's dig in. Okay, Marisa, so first, let's level set about what it means to feed as a team. For many parents, bringing in a caregiver or sending their child to daycare is often the first that they have to share this responsibility of feeding. So how important is it that everyone on your team is feeding your baby using the same strategy? Is it possible to finger food only at home and then let your caregiver use purees? Is consistency the key to feeding success at every stage?
This is such a good question because I also answer a lot of the questions that we get from our community, and this is a huge topic that comes up. And the fact is, this could happen, and you could encounter this for a variety of reasons, whether you as the parent feel uncomfortable with your caregiver feeding solids if you're not there to kind of witness how it's going. It could be because the caregiver is uncomfortable. For example, many grandparents I've seen are, fed their babies with the traditional pureed method. And if you're wanting to do finger food first, they might feel uncomfortable with it. It could be a daycare setting isn't allowed with the rules they have in place to actually do finger foods, kind of in the state they are now. So you could encounter this for a variety of reasons. And the fact is, babies are truly just so resilient and they're so adaptable. And the great news is they're really good at associating like a feeding style with a place or even sometimes with a certain caregiver. So we have people use the phrasing of is this going to mess up my baby? And it's not. The fact is they can puree with one caregiver, then they can have solids with you, and they're actually going to be really amazing. In fact, you might even see it as developing two different skill sets, honestly. With that in place, you could even try to see ways to kind of coach your caregiver to become more comfortable, and that's something we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about as we go on with some of the other questions here. But the good thing is too, it's also important to remember that you asked, is consistency the key to feeding at every stage? And what I like about that question is consistency is really key in terms of trying to at least stay consistent with expectations. So even if you are feeding with different approaches, if you can kind of still stick to things like the basic fundamentals of, if I offer something and baby doesn't seem to like it, I don't bring out something else. That's something you can still stay consistent in regardless of approach to feeding, and it's still establishing something early on. And I'll have many people say like, oh, well, how can I do that if my baby doesn't understand? Well, the fact is your baby may not understand, but just like you have a routine putting your baby down to bed, it becomes a predictable thing that helps wire them to get sleepy, right? First might do a bath, and then you're going to swaddle them, and then you're going to go ahead, maybe read a couple stories, rock, maybe do a milk feed, and they fall asleep. It's kind of a good pathway you're developing in the brain to get them sleepy. So similarly, we kind of want to stick with those same things. So your babies will learn by action. So as long as you're consistent across caregivers and trying to really reinforce that message, that can go a long way starting in infancy. And that way you'll have less of the toddler struggles when you hit that very, very difficult toddler stage.
Oh, that toddler stage. I know it so well. um, so no matter how you decide to feed your child, communication, just like you described, seems like it's pretty critical. In fact, I'd estimate about half of the questions we received prior to starting this webinar were in this camp. How do you create an open and, more importantly, positive dialogue around feeding with everybody in your village?
This is such a good question because it does come up quite a bit. So basically, I would always say just try to create open communication from the beginning. And to do that, you really want to, for both parties, ideally invite questions or share any anxieties or concerns right from the start. So ideally, you might ask a caregiver if they have any potential biases towards feeding your child. So for example, do they believe that one way of feeding is the right way to do it? You would want to know that because it's going to influence what they feel comfortable with feeding your child. You might want to know if they have any anxiety or discomfort. For example, if you're sending finger foods to a setting where they have not really done that before, or they're feeling a liability concern or something like that because they're not familiar with it, then that's when you might say like, okay, like I want to know that. So what can we do to kind of set everybody up for success? Because the fact is your baby will feel that from the caregiver, from you, the anxiety. And so we want to do whatever we can to kind of create a positive feeding dynamic, however we go about it. So I think whatever you can do to kind of start that open communication from the beginning, try to come at it from like an open place, ideally both parties, and just know that like you're trying to work together best to support baby. That's really, really a huge place to start.
What you just described about sort of having, someone in your life having a difference of opinion as you, that happened to me with my first child. Grandparents just were really against kind of baby-led weaning. So can you talk a little bit more about what happens when someone you share this responsibility with has a difference of opinion than you? And just like some practical tips for us.
Yeah, so I think this is super common. So I think it's important as a parent to decide what you're comfortable with and what's a deal breaker for you, right? So it's important to know that. And Sally, we see this so much this comes about not just with style of feeding, but even about what your child is fed, right? Like we often see the grandparents sneaking the kid, treats or things like that, or even I've had the situation one time where, when sending my girls to home daycare, they sent me a picture of them eating goldfish and like puffs as a snack, when I would prefer more like, and what I was doing with them was I wanted to do different like whole foods and things like that. And so I've had experience having to have a conversation of feeling like uncomfortable with kind of what's happening there. So ideally, if you come to the conversation and you come with it with setting an intention that you want to get on the same page, and explicitly state that. If you're going to have a conversation with a caregiver, just say like, hey, like I know you're going about things this way, or we had this conversation about what you're feeling with my baby. I would love to find a way so we can get on the same page and we create conversations so that we can be open about it and none of us ever feel defensive because we know we just want what's right for this child, right? Like you as the parent will say, I want what's right for my baby and I want to feel calm and comfortable and I trust you. And I would imagine you also want to feel comfortable in your interaction with my baby. And I would so appreciate your support. So how can we do this together, right? So stating it explicitly. And then if they're on a different page from you and like you want them to, for example, we see this come up a lot with our parents who do choose to go the finger food first approach is, you know, somebody who is traditionally used to puree feeding, they might say like, oh, well, your baby's, you know, they're going to choke or I'm not comfortable with that. So finding ways to arm the caregiver with knowledge, right? So, I mean, we're here too because we're also recently creating our caregiver course aimed at caregivers. And the idea is we want them to feel supported in knowing basic infant rescue, knowing what to do or what gagging looks like and know that that's okay. Sharing evidence-based information. So like knowing that just the word of mouth of, you know, increased choking is not necessarily true. It's actually shown to not be true. So giving all this information, sharing the knowledge, showing videos of babies eating so that they're familiar with what they're going to expect, that can go such a long way. So if we can start that conversation and really just encourage that, then ideally everybody will feel more supported and kind of more ready to dive in kind of on the same team.
Yeah. And what you just kind of described was, parents and caregivers feeling a little anxious. And for so many, feeding comes with a lot of anxiety, especially when parents can't be in the room when it's happening. What are some of the strategies you suggest to parents to ease that anxiety, particularly around someone else doing the feedings? And then any specific tips for parents dealing with food allergies or other specific needs that might deepen that anxiety? I have 2 children who have a lot of food allergies. And so, it does bring a lot of kind of stress to the situation.
That's a great question. And allergies are so hard to navigate, especially if you're going to like a group daycare setting where there are multiple kids and maybe other foods being brought. There's so much stuff around anxiety there. So I would always just say, like, feel free to ask questions, advocate for yourself, for your baby, kind of know what's going on, and then just have a plan in place, right? So if you want to make sure that the communication is more clear with your caregiver, write out something, a plan about what you feel comfortable with. And you might even ask them to kind of repeat it back to you in a way, or can you tell me or show me how this would work in your caregiving setting to make sure that this is going to feel the most safe and comfortable. The fact is, with allergies, it helps to remember you as a parent don't want your child to have an allergic reaction. And I guarantee you, your caregiver does not want to experience that either. So it helps to remember we all want our babies to be safe. We don't want to be put in that situation, no matter kind of which end of the kind of relationship you're on here. So whatever we can do to make that the most clear and figure out, like, for example, if it's coming to your home, it might be a little bit more anxiety reducing because you'll have more control over the environment. But sending your baby to like a daycare setting, for example, might feel extra kind of scary. So maybe you are able to kind of walk through with the caregiver, like, what's this going to look like where you are? What is your feeding situation when you are feeding my baby? Like, how are they going to be set up? How are we going to make sure their foods are separated from other kids? What can I do to make sure I feel comfortable? And then lastly, it's going to be also making sure that they're prepared, right? So do you know how to recognize an allergic reaction? Do you know the difference between a mild or a moderate to severe reaction? Do you know when you just need to monitor or how to look for other signs? Or do you know when you need to get emergency services, right? And having that conversation, you as the parent feeling comfortable that the caregiver knows what to do in those situations. And then really just being able to say, like, okay, like, there is going to be an element of trust that has to be there. And so at some point, yes, as a parent, and it's so hard, I've been there where you have to hand your baby over to somebody else. It's so, so hard and it feels unnatural, truly it does. So being able to do that and just really try to just trust in place and have continued conversation along the way, it's the best thing you can do to kind of relieve some of that anxiety.
Yeah. It all goes back to communication. It's so important. One of the questions that I get all the time from parents starting their child at daycare or in a school setting, is, will my child actually eat during the day? And what if they don't? How can parents cope with feeding transitions, like starting their child at daycare, or maybe introducing a new food category, or even moving from purees to solids when a caregiver's involved?
So this is such a good question. And I will even say with my own son, when he started daycare, he went on a hunger strike. So I've experienced this where he didn't eat for like 3 days when he was at daycare. It's so stressful. Even if you know all this, like it's so stressful because you want your baby to eat. That's like your only job, right? When you have a baby. So I feel like it's so important to know that it's really about what your baby gets in a 24-hour period. So if we're talking milk feeds here, even if your baby went a good chunk of the day without getting milk feeds, they can do something where they basically, especially for like nursing parents, they may do what's called reverse cycling, where they might nurse throughout the night. And sometimes that's how parents get away with their babies not eating very well at daycare, as it's not the best sleep for us as nursing parents, but it's important to know that that is an option. And same thing with solids. Like if they didn't eat very much at daycare, then knowing that they can still make it up later. But sometimes it's also just like, again, not letting the anxiety kind of getting the best of the situation, really trying to hold to it, stick with it, wait it out, try to exude calmness. And ideally, you want the caregiver to exude calmness as well. It's going to be, again, hard for them too. No caregiver wants to be in a situation where a baby is not eating. It's not fun for them either. They're going to be dealing with the fussy, crying baby, feeling like they can't, quote unquote, fix it. So I think it's good to know that we all want to work together, try to keep a calm state of mind, and then kind of work together, like basically figure it out with the kid and how best to support them. In my own situation, what I can say is I waited it out. It was a good 3 to 4 day period where he wasn't eating. And then all of a sudden, miraculously, he started. And I think it was almost just like sticking with it. I didn't come in and like rescue right off the bat. It was kind of just like, okay, we all need to figure this out. It's new for everybody. It's new for me. It's new for the caregiver. It's new for the baby, right? It's a whole new environment change. So I think that's important. And then also, if you're particularly anxious, check in with your pediatrician. You'll often find, like, I'll get parents emailing us all the time saying, like, I'm worried about my baby's weight. Well, then I would encourage you to go to a pediatrician's office. Many times you can do a quick weight check there. You don't necessarily need an appointment. You can check with them and they can track your baby's growth on their growth curve. I would encourage this more than weighing your child at home because their scales are typically not sensitive enough and it can elicit unnecessary anxiety, truly, because people will tell me, oh, they've dropped. And also dropping a couple, little points here and there, like day in, day out is okay. It's about kind of like the weekly trajectory on the growth curve. So keeping that in mind, and then just also making sure that when you start off this caregiver relationship, ensure they're knowledgeable. If your baby, for example, struggles taking a bottle and you're just trust falling into a caregiving situation, you may have to just say, like, how do you feel about this? Like, can you try to stay calm if it gets to a point where the baby's refusing food? Like, are you knowledgeable with strategies to help them take a bottle if they're not going to, for example, or eat solids in a certain way if they're not? And then the one other thing I want to say on this is that remember that solids, so this is a lot on milk feeds, but in solids, especially in the beginning, the focus is on skill building and not on consumption. Again, we say this all the time, milk feeds is the primary source of nutrition or hydration for the first year of life. And we want to use that as a safety net to kind of set these, like, take the pressure off of solids in the beginning, see it as an opportunity for exposure, let them do it. If they're fussy, don't push on it. Don't focus on how much they ate, more just, maybe the report or the handoff for that day is, hey, they actually sat down and touched the food for a little bit. That was great today. That's a step in the right direction. Hey, today they actually picked up the spoon, they flung it across the room, but at least they're kind of interacting more, right? And eventually maybe we'll get to the point where they feel more comfortable eating there, but it's okay to have this transition period.
Thanks for that. I'm sure that reduced a lot of anxiety in people. And then we have sort of the opposite of that, which is, children who often eat their best at daycare and parents kind of realizing that aspect. And I think there's another piece of this also is, oftentimes caregivers have sort of more patience for things than parents do. And, there's things that just as parents really get under our skin. So what are some of the secrets to success that caregivers can share with parents? And how can they share them in a constructive way, in a way that doesn't make the parent, feel terrible about themselves?
This is another great question. I feel like this comes back to establishing like open communication early on. It always comes back to that, right? So, and you want to encourage the conversation to go both ways. So as a caregiver, I think it goes a long way just to say, like, I've noticed this, like, would you be open to hearing some of the stuff that seems to be working well for us here? the other thing, I've seen both sides of this. Child eats better at daycare and not with the parents, or child eats better with the parents and isn't eating at daycare, right? Either situation can feel stressful. In both of these, it can really help to see the feeding relationship for yourself. And sometimes that's just seeing if the caregiver will take a video of the feeding interaction. It can be like such a simple thing. I've actually done this. Again, this was around solids with my son when he went to a larger daycare. And when I was able to kind of see the feeding interaction, all I could see was, and again, I'm a feeding therapist, so it's probably a little bit more different of a viewpoint, but I was able to see he was put there, and sometimes it may be something as simple as like, oh my gosh, you're not giving him a utensil. He's used to a utensil. Like for me, it was, you know what, you keep giving him the spoon, but if, or you're trying to like hand him a new food he's never had, if you put it on a fork, that might be more interesting for him and you might be willing to try it. And for me, that was the game-changing strategy. It's like the simplest thing, but it was the fix, right? So sometimes just seeing this, or you might see like, oh, like sometimes caregivers are so knowledgeable. They have fed so many children. So you might see like, oh, watching this, I'm noticing they're actually somehow putting less pressure than I thought. I wasn't doing a lot of pressure at home, but seeing this, maybe this is more, oh, I really see they're allowing my baby to have more control, and I'm actually seeing more enjoyment interaction. You might also see like sometimes the fact is that daycares, for example, a baby is typically eating around other kids. And that can be, it's a social thing, right? So maybe that shows you at home, if I'm able to, instead of focus on my baby eating, and I need to sit at the table with them and try to actually model eating more, that's such a key to eating. You might see that a lot in daycares because they're around other kids also eating, and it's exciting. Alternatively, they're not eating at daycare. Maybe you look at the video and see, oh, I think they look like they're distracted by this wall of toys over here. Is there some way we could just cover that? And maybe that's a fix, right? So just getting eyes on it and trying to kind of see that. And I talked to you, Rachel, before this, and it sounds like something you guys have mentioned, like something you would be able to work out would be a video quickly if a parent were to request that. But I think that goes such a long way, right? So also just remembering like sometimes parents might rely on screens to get their child to eat. And that's not typically a thing with a daycare situation, right? Or so sometimes you might see they're more, the mealtime is the activity, right? It's bringing them to the table. They're finding a way to engage with it, and they're finding ways to make that fun, right? And then alternatively, if you're talking about this kind of similar situation with like a grandparent or a caregiver, something I also like to remember is like, I always struggled with my kids eating as well with me. And I think it was purely because I was the nursing parent. Like sometimes there's that too. They know you're a source of other food that's more preferred. Like, or you're the one who's like normally would give them the bottle. And if you're maybe in the habit of just like, oh, they didn't eat, I'll give you a bottle then. They learn to accept that, and they'll hold out for that. So just like little things like that are also just an important reminder too. So in terms of the caregiver communicating as well, I would encourage any of the parents on this call too to just like come at this from a place of not assuming any judgment from a caregiver. Even in our caregiver course, we're really trying to outline like how can we communicate stuff to parents in a way that makes them feel supported, right? So we want to make sure that a parent is in a place to receive the feedback before we're providing it. And I think so long as we're saying like, hey, I'm noticing some things really working here. Like I hear you're struggling at home with feeding, we're having success. Can we explore together what might be different and figure out how to improve both situations to best support the baby? And I think always bringing it back to that context of supporting the child really makes a parent feel less like I'm doing this my way, you're doing this your way. It's more like, how can we best support your child? And that makes them feel like you're holding them, right? Like you've got them and you're there for them and you want to help support them.
Yeah. And we always have such success when parents and caregivers partner together and work together. Because like you said, everyone has the best interest of the child kind of at the forefront, and that's what matters most for everybody. So we are ready for some questions. If you want to go ahead and put some questions in the chat, please feel free. And while we wait for some to come through, we had a question that came in prior to the webinar that I'd love to jump into while we wait for questions. This is something that I've seen a lot as well, which is sort of, this idea of the mess that is involved with feeding and how that can be a little bit of a source of anxiety for some parents. especially, if you and your partner might have different ideas of what this looks like, or, when should we be wiping the mouths and, all of that good stuff. So can you talk a little bit about the benefits of getting messy with feeding? Because, again, it's so important.
Yeah, so I love that you're asking this. So basically, as mentioned, I am a feeding therapist and I'm also an occupational therapist by background. And so we're trained in like sensory integration, right? So like targeting all the different senses. So I think one thing many of us love with feeding is the sensory experience of it, really. So, and especially with getting the self kind of control or self feeding, it's really a great way to expose them to different textures. So sometimes it's about how you kind of approach a situation and the lens that with what you're looking at it, right? So if you come at it like, oh gosh, this mess, I am like not excited for it. But if you instead you come at it and say, ooh, this is an opportunity to get my baby exposed to different textures. And if you think about this in like the future, we're always prepping for years to come. So I want to avoid my baby or my child later not being able to participate in an art activity because they can't stand glue on their hands, right? Or I want them to be able to use the paint, use the glitter, or play in the sandbox with other kids. And I want them to be okay with other textures and not cry and stress out because something's on their hands, which is a thing that we encounter with as OTs, like we're working with later on, right? So from the beginning, if you kind of look at this with the feeding and say, okay, like first of all, do whatever you can to contain the mess, right? We also have a whole chapter on this as well in our many of our courses. We have stuff on our website all over because the mess is a huge concern. Splat mats, silicone craft mats to pick up and put away. The scoop bibs, if that's feels more comfortable for you, like whatever you can do to contain the mess. But then also coming to the table thinking, ooh, opportunity for them to explore. I want to expose them to a slimy food today. Let's bring out some eggplant, right? Or I want to expose them to something else and just trying to kind of see it in that way. I think that can go a long way. Maybe it froze for a minute.
Yeah, sorry, I think I was having a little bit of a technical difficulty there.
No worries. But I think that's, yeah, so that's like a huge part. And I think just like really seeing it that way. And then you also asked about wiping. So we often will say, wipe your child's face away from the table. And the reason is many babies don't like it. And you want to try to create a positive association at the table, in the high chair, during the mealtime. You want that to stay positive. So you don't want them to always anticipate having their face wiped. And therefore, eventually they might start avoid going in the high chair altogether. They start fussing and as soon as they're put in because they think of it as this negative experience. So you might bring them to the sink and wash them off. You might have like footy pajamas to like unzip and take off after they're done, but do things that ideally away from the table to decrease that negative association. But yeah, just looking at it and saying like, they are getting such awesome experience here. They are feeling textures. And then, from a feeding perspective and a protective thing against choking, I'm so passionate about the fact that self-feeding is truly the first phase of the swallow. If you think about when you are bringing a food to your own mouth, it's really interesting, your salivary glands activate. And so it's almost like already enzymes are getting ready to break the food down and your tongue starts moving in anticipation of the food and your lips will even start moving as you see it. So this all happens subconsciously for us, but for a baby, if they're getting so much information, picking up these foods and getting messy and feeling it all, they're already preparing for what that's going to feel like in the mouth. So just remembering that like, this is also a part of truly chewing and swallowing and really teaching them those skills as well.
It's all fascinating. There's so much that goes into it and so much more that kind of behind the scenes. I encourage people to put some questions in the chat for us. Another question that came in before our webinar was sort of about this idea of getting on the same page as your partner. And I know we talked a little bit about this, but if you and your partner disagree on not only on like the strategy of feeding, but the when, how much, and other feeding variables, how do you sort of handle that and navigate that situation when you might just not be on the same page?
This is so hard. And I wish I could create something all about like partner communication too. Like, I think, honestly, it could be like a couples therapy topic, right? For all of us in multiple situations. But I feel like it's just important to have a conversation. And ideally, if you anticipate this, I think as with anything, starting solids, like it's worth having a conversation before you get into it. Have a conversation about the strategy you want to take potentially that you may not even know your partner, you or your partner may not know how you feel about any one particular strategy until you start getting going on it. So doing whatever you can to prep both of you, right? So let's have a discussion, talk about like the pros and the drawbacks with any given approach. Maybe you both learn up on both strategies. You ask questions of people, ask your, you can ask your friends and family members who have done feeding what their experiences are. You can educate yourself as much as possible and try to, if you can, do this as a joint team. And if you can do this before you even start solids, it really sets you up more for success because you're already talking about it and kind of anticipating what anxieties will come about as you kind of learn more about the different strategies you can do. So ideally that if you're already in the thick of it and already disagreeing with your partner, make a point of sitting down to talk about it instead of having those arguments come up at the table in front of your child where we're always like, oh, I wish that it didn't come about that way, or I wish we weren't both so stressed about this. Set aside a time. Again, I always say just be intentional. Be intentional about it. Set aside a time where you say, hey, we have to figure this out. And this could be with a partner. It could be with extended family members. It could be with whoever. But like, I would like to talk about this, explain why I feel the way I do. I'd love to hear how you're feeling. And I want to go ahead and again, get us on the same page to support our baby, right? I think that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions that came through. One of the questions is about how important is frequency of eating food in a day, sort of in the 6 to 12 month age period. My daughter is 7 months and she's getting 4-ish milk feeds throughout the day and 2 little food meals at 12 p.m. and 5 p.m. And the person's looking for some feedback and any thoughts about the schedule or increasing to 3 meals.
So this is such a good question. In fact, we get questions like this so often because it's so confusing. Like, what are all the rules on this, right? And then, so we actually have a whole article on feeding schedules on our website. And that one's like a free resource because we get so many questions on this, right? So basically, we would say typically at like 6 to 7 months, you would do one meal a day is all that's needed, up to 2 meals a day if you want increased exposure. And that's fine. And again, not about intake, all about skill building, right? So no pressure on actually eating solids, no worry about how much you're offering in terms of how much they're consuming. Around 8 to 9 months is when you might move to like 2 meals per day. And then it's closer to 10 months that we would start thinking closer to 3 meals per day. And then we have on our website sample schedules, things like that, just to kind of help you think about it. And then also it's good to think about like timing of milk feeds and solids, right? So introducing solids maybe like at least 30 minutes, maybe longer after a milk feed to make sure that they're hungry enough when they come to the table, to make sure that they're not too hungry. There's like all these like perfect things in place that can set you up for success during the solids. But such a good question. I can post the website here if that's helpful in the chat.
That's great. I wish you were around when my kids were little. That's such a valuable resource. We also have a question that came in about mesh feeders, that a family is just about to start using one, and if you have any recommendations on which is the best one to start with.
Yeah, so great question about the mesh feeders. I don't necessarily have a best one because I think they're all pretty similar, honestly. It's a good resource if you're wanting to expose your baby to taste early on, things like that. It's very similar though to like kind of offering, I mean, it does give the chewing practice with like the puree texture. So sometimes this is a great thing to start with if a parent's feeling particular anxiety about like moving to more finger foods, but also want a little bit more of the chewing practice. With the mesh feeder, I will say it can also help to like expose them. Like your baby will suck on it probably too, but if you bring it a little bit to the side of the mouth, you might even trigger a little bit of the chewing, which might be really good practice. But yeah, they're all honestly really similar. An alternative to that, just for the families who are like, oh, if you're thinking about this in terms of like a taste and like texture kind of exposure, you'll also see like something that we talk a lot about too is food teethers, which is like, it almost feels like the opposite to like purees, which is like just those unbreakable resistive sticks of food. So I just like to bring this up because if you're thinking of mesh feeder, sometimes it's exposure to the taste and texture that you're looking for. But if you do these unbreakable resistive sticks of food, and we're talking like a mango pit, nothing's going to come off it because it's just the pit, but you have the flavor, you have the texture, and it's something they can still kind of mouth on teeth as they're holding it. It could be like corn on the cob because they're not going to get much of anything off, but it's giving you that proprioceptive input into the mouth, which basically helps you learn more about how to move the tongue and how to chew. So that's like another direction you can go in if you're interested in the mesh feeders as well. Those are called like food teethers or resistant sticks of food. So, but yeah, so I don't have an exact recommendation on specific mesh feeder.
Thank you. Any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but I'll go to our questions that were submitted prior to the webinar also. And one of the questions that came up quite a bit is kind of on this idea of meal planning in the sort of like 6 to 12 month range, and sort of like when to introduce foods and in what order, kind of the sequence of foods, and that came up quite a bit.
So, okay, so this is such a good question. So I'm really passionate as an OT as well, or a feeding therapist, and as a solid starts ambassador, if you will. I'm very passionate about feeding your baby what you would eat, right? Especially when we're talking about various cultures. There's no one right food. Everybody has a different cuisine that you might eat as part of your family. You do want to obviously like not have anything with like a lot of sodium. You want to avoid things like honey, right? Like raw fish, like all those other things. We kind of have a lot on our in our resources. Like we have all our starting solids resources, and we talk about which foods to avoid. But in terms of what food to start with, we have examples of like first food you could consider, but our first foods database where you can like look up any food, you can see any of them, they have an age for like starting at 6 months is when you can introduce that. And it's really more about how you prepare it, less about what food it is, right? So either you're going to go the traditional pureed route and you might find something that's mashable. And again, you might think like, you know, I had someone say like my kids' first food was pumpkin soup because that's what we had for dinner that night. You know? So as long as it's not like high in sodium, you kind of leave that out, that's fine. Or you might go the finger food route in which you're going to do it's like the opposite, right? These big sticks of food because baby can hold it, bring it to their own mouth and chomp on it. And you want to think about how to prepare it so that it kind of helps to kind of facilitate what you're looking for there too. So I'd say it's really about what's important to you. So I love one of my colleagues, I think Kim is actually not on this call, but I know, for example, she craved pineapple during her pregnancy. So wanted that to be her baby's first food because it was meaningful.
I love that. I love
Right.
that.
So like, and for me personally, I've loved just doing like the mini cucumbers, like cut into long sticks. And because it's like a teether, basically. It's like a hard, I leave the skin on. It's a hard skin. I do like watery bits is like kind of a great teether, and it gives them exposure, something coming off, but it's super thin. So they would just gnaw on it, and you love seeing like the tongue dart to the side. I just like nerd out over watching all the skills happening and the exploration of the food. So I love like a lot of people like avocado, cucumber sticks. Really like, again, the food teeth. I linked in here too, like there was some sticks of food, but those are a great place to start as well. So yeah, sorry, it's kind of vague because it really could be anything.
Yeah, no, and you know what, as you were talking, I was thinking back to my like own experiences when my kids were young, and I have 4 kids. And with my first, I was, you know, much more reserved and not as comfortable. And then by the time I had number 4, it was basically like, eat whatever that we're eating, obviously, from kind of, you know, in a safe way, but, you know, you just become more adventurous and more comfortable as time goes on too.
Very true. And I would say for anybody experiencing anxiety, just take that first step, because we get that a lot, is like, how do I first start solids when I'm so anxious? Is like, if you have, like, I love that you just said, like, you get adventurous with more kids. Like, if you have a friend or family member who's been there or has done this recently, like having them with you as you get started can just take so much of the anxiety away, because you're just like, I need someone to just like hold my hand through this. I just need someone to tell me that this is okay and what's happening is normal and that I don't need to freak out, because like it goes a long way.
Yeah, you know, I had actually, that's such a great piece of advice, and very similar. I had a friend who was over when we had babies around the same age, our last babies, and I think my daughter, I can't remember how old she was at the time, but she was eating, you know, I don't know, I don't even remember what it was, but my friend was so kind of floored that my child was eating this. And that was sort of like her gateway into, having this experience for her own child too. And it was such a kind of safe and comforting place to start. But yeah, I completely agree. Like, you have a support system, right? Lean on people in your network and in your village to kind of support you through this too.
Yeah. And since we're talking caregivers, you could do the same thing for the caregiver when they start, right? If you're starting to feel comfortable and the caregiver's not, maybe you're there with them when they first do a couple of things so they see kind of, or they're there watching you as you do it. I think that's just such a great way to almost just like prove like, hey, we can trust this baby. You can
Yes.
trust ourselves. We can trust the baby that they know what they're doing. Like, it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that. Any other questions or anything on people's minds that we have time for? Probably one other question if anyone's feeling adventurous, speaking of adventurous, and wants to kind of ask a question. Oh, this is a great question. Yeah. Thanks so much. So what is your favorite tip? And this is a great way to kind of end as well. What's your favorite tip for transitioning from purees to finger foods?
It's such a good question. I think the biggest thing is going to be definitely giving up control. So being able to, the first step could even just be like, if you've been spoon feeding, make sure that you're doing ideally responsive spoon feeding. So watching babies' cues, only giving the spoon when they're opening their mouth, not kind of like trying to like sneak bites in. But ideally, if you can, hand over the spoon, give them the spoon to hold. That's a good first step. Or maybe if you're nervous, again, we talk about these resistive sticks of food all the time because it's such a great way to navigate that anxiety. Because as you give these more resistive pieces of food, which you could dip in the purees, for example, they almost use it as a spoon. So you're able to see them kind of triggering chewing reflexes, their tongue moving to the side, all these skills they'll need for chewing. And you can do that with the purees as well. And then ideally, we get this question a lot is, how do I transition them? If I'm starting with solids later, like what size pieces do I give? So you can either give the bigger pieces, like we talk about these bigger pieces of food they can handhold for biting and tearing practice. And you can also give the smaller bite-sized pieces of food. I think it's really important to remember that regardless of approach to feeding you choose, you will have to give solids and ideally around 8 to 9 months, right? So like, even if you started with purees, because you're like, oh, that just feels more comfortable, ideally you'll see even with the traditional puree method, they recommend moving to solids, smaller pieces around 8 to 9 months. So whether you start with like our giant pieces we do with finger food first, or you're doing with purees or a combo and you are doing both, I think it's important to remember you're going to have to go there. And the smaller bite-sized pieces are going to make it so it's easier for your baby to manage a little bit in terms of chewing more. And if you're looking more at consumption, you are going to see a little bit more consumption with the smaller pieces because it takes less work. Whereas the larger pieces will be biting and tearing. And again, if you want to slowly, gradually move there in like a combination way, you can. And again, because we get this a lot, we have a whole bunch of content on our website about transitioning from spoon feeding to self-feeding, or we call it from spoons to fingers. Because it's a tricky stage, right? A lot of people start with puree too, because it's a comfort zone, but you still have to get to solids at some point, and that anxiety is still going to be there. And so how do we get there? I think that's a really, really great question. But yeah, that would probably be my best tips there.
Thank you so much. Marisa, thank you so much for taking time and sharing all of your wisdom with everybody. I hope everyone feels a little bit more equipped to tackle any sort of feeding that's coming their way, and whatever stage you're in, that you have some tools to kind of take you to the next stage. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We know it's hard to carve out this time, and we really appreciate that you did. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Marisa.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.